Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiege. Today is July the 9th, with more stories around the NFL that I wanted to get to on today's show. Very heavy on the NFC just in general topics. A lot more going on in that conference than the AFC. We're going to start off with the interaction on X between CeeDee Lamb and former Cowboys wide receiver Cole Beasley over some training methods to go off of, and then it somehow got into the amount of targets that CeeDee Lamb got compared to Cole Beasley. So we're going to go into that. Then the last time we're going to talk about the first episode of Hard Knocks offseason following the New York Giants. The next episode is set to drop tonight, so one more time we're going to discuss it on today's show, and we're going to also get into A.J. Terrell, the star cornerback for the Atlanta Falcons. He is entering the fifth year of his rookie deal. What is he looking like for an extension? How likely is it that he gets one? And how much is he looking to get in a potential new contract with the Falcons? That is coming up, plus much more. Before I start, I want to remind you guys, if you have any questions or comments, please use the tip and donations link, GSMCpodcast.net. By using that, I'm able to see your question. It'll pop up in the chat box, and that way I'll read it on air and get your guys' thoughts on anything I say or any of the topics. It's a massive help for this show and the network, so please, if you guys would, use the tip and donations link, GSMCpodcast.net. But that allows us to jump right into the first segment. Like I mentioned, a interaction, very interesting one, between CeeDee Lamb and Cole Beasley. Basically, if you guys know what's been going on with CeeDee Lamb, he has been away from the team this offseason and hoped to get a new big-time deal in an exploding wide receiver market that has just absolutely taken off, with Justin Jefferson resetting the entire thing, earning $35 million per year. And his stats aren't too far off of what CeeDee Lamb has produced for the Cowboys, so you can anticipate that CeeDee is looking to get something within that range. But will the Cowboys give it to him eventually? Will they get something done with Dak and then maybe CeeDee Lamb? That's all still in the works right now. The only thing I've seen from CeeDee Lamb, because he has been away from the Dallas Cowboys holding out for that new contract, is the workout videos. Like any other wide receiver posts on social media throughout the offseason, him working out with some other guys, his personal trainers, and things like that. And in one of the videos, he's doing nothing out of the ordinary, some plyometric workouts or something like that. And one of the comments was from former wide receiver for the Dallas Cowboys, Cole Beasley. Basically, all he said was, man, just do some heavy squats and power cleans, to give advice to CeeDee Lamb, I guess, because maybe he's not a fan of other things. He's just more traditional or something like that. And that's all he said. But then, of course, a fan gets involved and sort of starts this thing that starts to snowball from this point on. A fan responded to Cole Beasley's comment and said, "Is Cole really trying to tell CeeDee how to train?" Laughing emoji. Beasley has literally never eclipsed 1,000 yards. And Cole Beasley, if you know anything about Cole Beasley, he doesn't usually back down from things like these. He always has a response to something. He always goes back at someone, and he responded by saying, "Give me 180 targets off the couch and I eclipse 1,000. Stop looking at stats and check the tape. As far as getting open goes, I'm confident I did that with the best of them." Now, that obviously was in response to the fan, but the first part, give me 180 targets off of the couch, some people could interpret that differently, and CeeDee Lamb was one of those people, because when he read that comment, he had to respond now, because it almost seems like Cole Beasley was implying that CeeDee needs all these targets to obviously get and attain the season that he had last year, a historical season for the Cowboys, for a Cowboys wide receiver, and for CeeDee Lamb himself. So CeeDee Lamb also responded, and he said, "I don't need 180 targets to touch a band. Pull up tape, I'd match you route for route on getting opened. Just chill." And after that, the whole situation, interaction sort of died down. Beasley didn't come back too much at CeeDee Lamb. All he said was, "Never said you did." And I know one other tweet out there that he said was to just stop being sensitive, because really Beasley was trying to say, and he tried to clear up after, that it wasn't really meant for CeeDee. It was more so towards the trainers that are doing all these extra workouts, all this extra stuff to wide receivers, where clearly Cole Beasley just is more of a heavy squat guy, power clean guy. He meant it more towards the trainers, thinking that this was extra, but at the same time, you could understand it from CeeDee's point, right? 180 targets, especially when he's trying to get paid this year. If other people see that comment, if other people take it and run with it, if CeeDee Lamb maybe never said anything, social media and people on the internet could take that a bunch of different ways, and that way people might look at that and say, you know what, Cole Beasley might have a point. CeeDee Lamb is the only wide receiver on the Cowboys. Because of that, Dak has to force feed him. He gets 180, 200 targets compared to these other guys that don't get the same share. Only that's the reason why CeeDee had such a great season. It's not because he's a great wide receiver. It's because the Cowboys force feed him, forcing him to get these sort of stats and have a great season. And you don't, at the same time, you do acknowledge the fact that this is just an interaction on social media, but to kind of take CeeDee Lamb's side on why he would respond, I was surprised he did respond anyway, just because he hasn't really said much on anything on his contract negotiations. He hasn't brought up the fact that he should get paid that much or how it's going with the Cowboys. He's been pretty silent for the most part, but he responded, and I could try to understand, he's in a contract year. He's trying to get paid and trying to be seen as high of value as Justin Jefferson or an A.J. Brown or an Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's trying to get a contract up to the level of those guys, and if you now have this, and don't put out this small forced fire, per se, that Cole Beasley might not have meant to, but he said it anyway, and people might interpret it a different way. It might start to build up this narrative that, oh yeah, CeeDee doesn't really stack up to those guys because he gets a lot more targets than they do. So I can understand it by CeeDee why he'd respond and why he might seem a little bit sensitive, but at the same time, we're talking about a lot of money for CeeDee Lamb, life-changing money, huge contract extension, and he's earned that for sure. I think he's earned it off the season that he had. Definitely helped out Dak in performing as well as Dak did. So they really complemented each other, and he was a massive piece for the Cowboys last season. And, I could see it from that point why CeeDee would respond. But was this situation overblown? Was there anything really deeper than the fact that this could have been misinterpreted, or CeeDee might have been a little bit sensitive, maybe unnecessary by Cole Beasley to come back at the fan by saying something like this? I would probably say this situation was overblown a little bit rather than not, just because, again, it was just a fan that sparked this. It was a fan that instigated Cole Beasley, and he might not have thought twice about what he was saying, how it could have been interpreted differently. And that's the day and age, obviously, that we live in. Some people say something, they mean something completely different, and then it goes in a direction where nobody really ends up winning and everyone just ends up arguing. But that's really where I saw this, and where, it wasn't an ongoing thing for like a long time. It was just a back and forth a little bit by CeeDee and Cole Beasley. I'm sure they didn't really pay too much attention to it afterwards, but I think it was worth bringing up the fact that CeeDee and other players that you might see, be oversensitive about something is because they are on the verge, potentially, of getting a lot of money, and CeeDee Lamb has certainly earned that. He wants to continue to build on that. I'm sure he'd love to stay with the Cowboys, but right now it's taken a little bit extra time, with Dak Prescott being the priority, it seems right now, with him talking to media recently over this past weekend, how the talks are still ongoing between him and the Dallas Cowboys, and nothing really has moved since then. So the only thing that does is just push CeeDee Lamb's contract negotiations further back, and he's going to have a youth camp coming up in a few days, and he refused to talk about his contract negotiations at that point as well. So you could sense a little frustration from CeeDee from these actions, and just proclaiming that he's not going to talk about his contract just because, again, maybe nothing has happened, and I'm just assuming now at this point. But I would guess if something were to happen, or if the contract negotiations were moving in a positive direction, I don't think CeeDee would refuse right away to talk about it. Just like Dak, completely different people, but just like Dak, he is in the middle of the contract negotiations, and he's willing to talk about it, but he's not going to crunch numbers or project anything like that, but he's at least open to talk about it. CeeDee is really keeping to himself, not mentioning that at all, not answering any questions about it. So that frustration a little bit, maybe with the how slowly the process is going, and then you see something like this, you can kind of understand why CeeDee would respond. But again, I think it was just overblown at the end of the day. If I had to choose between this situation being overblown or just being a lot more deep, it definitely struck a nerve. But at the end of the day, it just comes down to that contract CeeDee's trying to get. And Cole Beasley knows that. Didn't mean anything by it, I'm sure, but still, it happened. It was something that I found interesting because, again, CeeDee's kept quiet this whole time. This is really the first time that he's brought anything up to sort of defend himself for his value and things like that. But let me know what you guys think about the interaction. Did you guys see it? Did you agree with Cole Beasley? Did you think that there was anything more to this interaction than maybe I'm seeing? Leave your guys' thoughts in the comments section. But off of that topic, we're going to go into a break, and when we return after that, the last time we will talk about the first season of Hard Knocks, the off-season version, with the second season, or the second episode, starting tonight. We're going to go over one more conversation between General Manager JioSaavn and Giants owner John Mara on Saquon Barkley and how they disagreed a little bit on whether to keep him or trade him. That is coming up after the break. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Back here now to talk some more about Hard Knocks, the off-season version, following the New York Giants over this offseason, a special one because it is their 100th season. So what went down, some big transactions and just actions overall with the Giants in free agency, the draft. It's a good thing they selected them because they became a big story, and there's a lot of entertaining things just to take from the first episode. And I couldn't move on from the first episode without talking about this conversation between John Mara and General Manager JioSaavn. John Mara is the owner of the New York Giants, and it was a very brief one, but I thought it did hold a lot of just significance overall to the first episode and how this Saquon Barkley process just went through, because this conversation took place on February 13th over Saquon, if they were going to tag him and then try to look for a trade market for him, or if they were just willing to let him hit free agency. Obviously, they just let him hit free agency, but some more context behind it. General Manager JioSaavn was explaining to John Mara in the scene how he didn't want to offer that $7 million salary that they had in mind, that they were valuing Saquon at, probably roughly about $7 million, because he wanted to avoid the just wave of criticism, talking points from the media on the Giants just offered Saquon $7 million. Like, how dare they disrespect him? How dare they offer him so little for everything that they did? Or just having to try to avoid this becoming a massive thing. He was a little bit hesitant over offering that $7 million salary because of that. So they had to at least move on a little bit, and they were going to be open to trading him if no offer came. If no offer came after that, their first option, they were going to look to trade him, obviously to get something back. But if no offer came, and no offer did come, they'd be okay with letting him hit free agency and find his market. This was the plan, right? No trade. Trade was the first thing that happens. If no offers come in, because teams outside of the Giants obviously have the leverage knowing that Saquon is going to be a free agent anyway, so why would they offer a trade? They could just wait a little bit longer. I'm sure a lot of other teams were getting an intel or a sense that the Giants weren't going to franchise tag him again, so they were buying their time, waiting until free agency, getting that feeling that the Giants were just going to let him hit free agency. But overall, the plan was if no offer came in, they'd be okay with letting him hit free agency, find any other value that other teams are offering, find his market, and then they expected Saquon to come back and let them know if they could match another offer that he had. You know, if he got one from the Eagles, the Texans, maybe the Ravens also before they got Derrick Henry, they expected Saquon to come back to them and say, look, I have this. What are you guys willing to offer me maybe to counter this, offer more, maybe get me to stay? That was the plan from the New York Giants. And once General Manager JioSaavn explained that to John Mara, you know, he processed it, and he really just simply responded with, in a perfect world, I'd still like to have him back, is all that John Mara said. And after that, JioSaavn kind of in a mindset where it looks like he's already past the idea of trying to keep Saquon. I'm sure I'm not the only person to think that from the first episode. It looked like Shane was more inclined to just accept the fact that he didn't feel that Saquon was coming back. Rather, with John Mara, you could see from his expression and just how it's crazy when you see the episode that he's just sort of standing there, almost just like a defeated look on his face, like not believing that Saquon really has a good chance of leaving the Giants with how much he's done for them, where they drafted him a while back ago. To lose him for almost nothing, you know, that was sort of starting to set in from John Mara, and just the defeat on his face, which just like sad to see almost in a way. But JioSaavn responded to what John Mara said about trying to keep him. Ideally, he said, really their main idea was to bolster the offensive line in order to make sure they get a clear answer on Daniel Jones. It always circles back to Daniel Jones, right? And it has to. It has to circle back to Daniel Jones because they decided to pay him the season before, a lot of money at that. And so with that, you're handcuffed with him for that time being. A lot of decisions are going to be based off of what you did there, especially for some of the big players that you have. Only really Saquon on the offensive side of the ball. They obviously didn't have Brian Burns at that moment, but those things are influenced by your quarterback making a lot of money. And he mentioned he wanted a clear answer on Daniel Jones, almost like basically saying, we made this choice on Daniel Jones. Saquon's not looking good right now, so we have to see if Daniel Jones works because we've already decided on that. And Saquon might just have to be a casualty for that decision that we make because we just can't afford him if we want to improve the rest of the team. That's the message, the feeling I was getting from General Manager JioSaavn when he was talking to John Mara. And now they have no choice now to try to make this as successful as possible. And obviously from that interaction back on February 13th, like I said, this conversation between John Mara and JioSaavn, Saquon becomes a free agent. Did he come back and say what offer he got with the Eagles? That's probably likely. And then at that point, you saw how Saquon responded to some of the hate he got from Giants fans. He said that they basically didn't offer him anything. So I'm starting to believe that side of it a lot more rather than the Giants saying, you know, maybe the Giants' point of view is that he just took the deal and when he never came back. I'm starting to believe more that he got a deal, an offer from the Philadelphia Eagles, and now he probably came back to the Giants and said they want to pay me this, and maybe they just didn't offer him anything. And when you have $12.5 million standing in front of your face like that as a running back, it's really, the choice is made for you right then and there. Eric says, NFL teams are so hung up on the fact that a quarterback has to be the face of your franchise. If the Giants let Jones test the market, what kind of options would he have? I don't think many. That's what I've been saying. That's what I've been saying, Eric. Too many teams are hung up on just having an okay quarterback having seen a little glimpse of him and then giving him, the keys to the franchise right away. And especially when they're comparing, when you're trying to see the value in other players that you have, the quarterback will always take precedent. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but at the same time, in this situation, it always has to do specifics with what you're dealing with a certain team. If it was Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce, you're obviously going to prioritize the quarterback ahead of everything. But in this situation, we're talking about Saquon and Daniel Jones. I find it hard to believe to prioritize the quarterback, even though he is probably the most important piece to everything. We're talking about Saquon and Daniel Jones, right? I think it has to go beyond just talking about the positions, and rather looking at the value that the player does bring to you. And it doesn't help that Saquon's a running back, obviously, because that market has been so diluted that all these teams really are hesitant to offer them a lot of money. But everything has to be based off of that, off of the quarterback. And with them paying Daniel Jones a lot of money, now they have no choice but to try and make this work. And this year, like I talked about in previous episodes, they're going to have to try and make this work. We saw them add to the offensive line with John Runyon, bringing him over. It definitely helped. It's a lot better now, that offensive line. They brought in Devin Singletary to replace Saquon in a way. They drafted Malik Neighbors. So they're really trying their best to go all in here and get a final decision on Daniel Jones, because if we talk about worst and best case scenario for the Giants, very different things that could go in perpendicular directions, or just very opposite directions if this season doesn't turn out how they envisioned it. If we look at the worst case scenario, we see more of the same thing. Daniel Jones proves that he's not the guy. He doesn't play that well. It's clear that he's really the weaker link in that offense, for a lack of better terms. He doesn't impress again. You move on next season because you're not convinced by Daniel Jones, and at the end of the day, you're almost forced to move on from Daniel Jones if he doesn't play well. Worst case scenario, maybe he's dealing with injuries again. He just doesn't play good in general. The other pieces are doing all right, but Daniel is really struggling, and you're really left with no choice but to move on next season, because it gets to a point where too many people are talking about it now, and how could you not move on from Saquon? You have to move on. You have to get a new quarterback. How much more do you need for him to show you that, to know that he's not the guy for this franchise? So you're going to be forced to move on next year, and then at that point, big picture, over the last 3 off seasons, you lost Saquon for nothing. You gave a lot of money to Daniel Jones, and now you're forced to move on from that massive contract and start this whole process over again by trying to find a new quarterback without having Saquon Barkley on your team. You could have tried to extend Saquon before Daniel and then maybe lose out on the quarterback, but again, it goes back to your point, Eric, that's a big fear for a lot of teams, that they just don't want to accept losing a quarterback for a running back especially, and they decided to go against it. And now, big picture, next offseason, they could be without a quarterback and without Saquon on their team, and then they're in a really bad spot then compared to what we've seen over the last few seasons. But on the flip side, best case scenario, you get some sort of resemblance from Daniel Jones in that year in 2022. He's healthier. He stays healthy the majority of the year with a better offensive line, an improved wide receiver room. It looks a little bit better. There's more optimism. I don't think playoffs is realistic with this team. Even if they do get better and Daniel Jones is healthy, I just still see them lacking. Compared to other teams in the NFC, I think they're one of the more weaker ones, obviously. So if you get close to 500, maybe a game or 2 above it, or a game below that, or just anywhere in that range, I think it's fair. And you'd feel a lot better about writing out this contract with Daniel Jones, rather than being forced to just release him or just move on from him next offseason. If you're a little bit mid-table average compared to just really bad like you have been, I think that'll be enough to write out his contract at least and not be pressured into doing something next offseason, because once you do that, it just really crumbles from there. I think people just start taking the heaviest decisions at that point, maybe getting rid of Brian Dable. You move on from Daniel Jones, and then you're forced into this situation where you have to see change right away. But if you get something close to mid-tier level of a team, 500 or something like that, I think people will be able to accept Daniel Jones for the remainder of his contract, and then you don't offer him another extension, and then you can move on from there, see where you are, and reevaluate. I think 2 years are left on Daniel Jones' contract, so that is where it stands right now. Best case scenario, it doesn't get too much better, but at least, you're not forced into doing something right away where you're not really ready to do that. So that's where the Giants stand right now. That's where I brought that whole conversation with JioSaavn and John Mara on how that interaction went with Saquon Barkley, and again, how all these decisions are based off of that choice that they made by re-signing Daniel Jones. He could prove everyone wrong. It is a possibility, but it's unlikely at this point, just from what we've seen from him. But that's how they're going to head into 2024. A very young team, led probably by Malik, Daniel Jones on that side of the ball. Good defensive additions with Dexter, Brian Burns, and Kayvon Thibodeau, but this is a scoring league. This is a passing league. If you don't have that firepower, it's very hard to compete in a lot of these games where that's all teams focus on. So I don't anticipate them. I'm anticipating more of the worst case scenario, if I'm being honest. But who knows? I could be surprised. I could be totally wrong or exactly right. We're going to just have to see how it plays out at this point in time. But that's all we're going to talk about, actually, on the first episode of Hard Knocks, the offseason version. We're going to go into another break, and when we return, some more contract talks, this time around A.J. Terrell, the defensive back for the Atlanta Falcons. He's in a contract year, so we're going to break down what his new contract could look like, and if there's any chance this could be the last year with him with the Atlanta Falcons. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Jumping into our next segment here on the show, a contract negotiation that has been going on this offseason that I don't think a lot of people have brought up, or I at least haven't really talked about or focused on this season, is A.J. Terrell and his contract negotiations going on with the Atlanta Falcons. Terrell is entering that coveted fifth-year option for his rookie deal, or I guess coveted by the Falcons, not so much by A.J. Terrell to get to that point, but of his rookie deal in 2024, that'll be his fifth-year option deal, and Atlanta obviously picked it up last offseason, so it is there if they do end up using it, or at least if they don't offer him a new contract. He'll play out the year on that fifth-year option. And what's the word on how this has been moving on? Because, again, we haven't seen too many updates at all on what this could look like or when this could be done. So one update that I did see was from the Athletics' Josh Kendall. He reported that Atlanta want to sign A.J. Terrell to a long-term deal before the negotiations get tense, in their words and Josh Kendall's words. So he expects it to get done soon, probably before training camp. But if we look at A.J. Terrell and what he has been for the Atlanta Falcons so far through his tenure there, if we look at A.J. Terrell, I'm going to get to that year in just a second, but he was drafted 16th overall, and he has played in 61 games of all the total games he could have played in the NFL. He's only missed at most 3 games in each season that he has missed games, so That's very encouraging. He's not a player that you really have to worry about injuries or anything like that. He's pretty reliable from that standpoint, so I really like seeing that through 4 seasons in the NFL. And if you look at this year, he was drafted in 2020, an okay year. You know, you don't expect too much from a rookie defensive back, but then in his sophomore year, he earned All-Pro honors. During that, he earned All-Pro honors after this year, technically, after the season concluded. So he recorded 81 tackles, 16 passes defended, and 3 interceptions just in that year. And that was really the moment where fans, the team, really knew that they had something in A.J. Terrell, because the first year, it was hit or miss. There was some good, there was certainly some bad, but after he makes, you know, an all-pro team and things like that, you're really starting to push in a way where A.J. Terrell is seen as a guy that you could really invest into on the defensive side of the ball. I've been very critical of the Falcons on that side of the ball, more so their pass rush, because their secondary with Terrell, with Jesse Bates, I think is at least solid with those two guys. So he's obviously been a big part of that over these last few years. But since that All-Pro year in 2021, he has failed to secure an interception since that point. He finished 2022 on a bit of a decline. He ranked 62 in his position after that year, so a big dip in performance after this 2021 year, but he rebounded a little bit in 2023, was ranked a bit higher in the cornerback rankings, but also no interception last year as well. So after you see all that, after that breakdown of A.J. Terrell, kind of a mini summary of what he has been in the NFL, I still think he's in a good spot to get that extension. Now, when we're talking about money, there's a lot of comparing. There's a lot of, with any contract negotiation, there's a lot of market value things that come into play. Right now, the highest paid cornerback in the NFL is Jair Alexander. He's making $21 million per year. He's leading the way for all corners. No one's broken that threshold just yet. But I don't think A.J. Terrell's going to get that money. I'm just stating it for the fact that Jair Alexander is up there among, I want to say Denzel Ward is another one that's right up there. He might be second or third. But regardless of that, what's really important to look at here is the other defensive backs that were also drafted in 2020 in the NFL draft, like A.J. Terrell was. If you look at those guys, you have Chicago's Jalen Johnson. He was franchise tagged this year, and he got paid very nicely this offseason. So that's one guy. Then L'Jarius Sneed, who was also tagged by the Kansas City Chiefs. He was traded to the Tennessee Titans, and now he got a massive contract extension that the Chiefs weren't able to pay, so the Tennessee Titans were, and he got a massive bag for that. Then also, you look at the Dallas Cowboys' Trayvon Diggs. He also got a massive extension, I want to say last offseason. So those are 3 guys already right there that were also drafted in 2020. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't think Jalen Johnson, L'Jarius Sneed were drafted ahead of A.J. Terrell, but I'd have to double check that. But just off of my memory, I don't think they were. So all 3 of those guys already got paid, and they're all making either $19 or $20 million per year on their contract extension. So one would think A.J. Terrell looks at this, and in my opinion, he's not too far off from some of these guys. I would probably take Jalen over him, L'Jarius Sneed over him. It's close with Trayvon Diggs. I might take A.J. Terrell over Trayvon Diggs, honestly. But regardless of that, there's not this big discrepancy in terms of talent and ability to play. I think they're all pretty similar to each other, so A.J. Terrell could look at that, and obviously he's going to back himself and think, well, if they're making this much money, and we were all drafted in the same class, I should probably be making 19 or 20 if these guys are also making that, and he obviously believes he's the best out of the bunch. So that's one thing that the Falcons and A.J. Terrell have to really negotiate and iron out, where they could find a compromise in his true value with the Falcons or potentially elsewhere if these negotiations don't figure themselves out. There's still the option of franchise tagging him. The franchise tag right now for defensive backs is set at $19.4 million, so that is right there with these contract extensions that these other corners got. So it might not be such a bad thing for Terrell to get tagged in comparison to other situations where you get the franchise tag and it's not up to par or really close to what your value is. If you're getting paid $19 million for that franchise tag in 2025, where they could use it on Terrell, it's still a decent thing for Terrell to make that money, play out that franchise tag year, and then if the negotiations don't go well, then you can move on. And you haven't really been underpaid until that point with that fifth-year option, because it is right there with some of the salaries that these other guys are getting in 2020. So obviously, maybe if the Falcons don't value him that high, it could be something that they don't want to do or want to get to that point. So again, it's almost flipped now with the Falcons and Terrell, because you usually see the player trying to get this deal done to try and avoid the franchise tag. But if Terrell gets it, it doesn't really hurt him too much financially because that is guaranteed for the franchise tag. So he'll get that guaranteed $19 million, and it's flipped because now the Falcons want to try to avoid that rather than wanting to do that like other situations. So that's another curious point that is brought up in this. But without a franchise tag, if the Falcons think that's too expensive for them, they don't want to do that, so AJ Terrell would be a free agent next offseason. So I think he would really lead that cornerback class of free agents if he were to hit it for some reason. I think a lot of teams would like to get AJ Terrell on their team to be their number one. If you look at teams, I've talked about them before, like the Patriots, like the Cardinals, I'm sure the Commanders as well. All those guys are going to be big. All those teams are going to be massive players in the market next year because they still have a lot of cap space this year, and it's only going to grow next year. So those guys are going to be willing to spend. If you have a guy as talented as AJ Terrell, only 26 years old, I'm sure one of those teams would love to have him on their team. So right now, I think it's more so the Falcons that want to get this done sooner rather than later with AJ Terrell. So that is something to keep in mind. And also, going back to that point of me being critical of this defense, AJ Terrell is one of the shining spots of this defense. One of the players I will not criticize because I do think he is a good player. So with that being the case and them not really addressing the defensive side of the ball too much in free agency or in the draft, I don't see a way where the Falcons can be okay with losing AJ Terrell in any sort of circumstance. I feel like they have to get this deal done, especially with new coaching coming in. You don't want to have a part of your team that's really lacking, or you don't want to lose a player right away, really before you start getting into your tenure and starting to get into your ebbs and flow of this team and really figuring out who works for you and who doesn't work for you. And also with Raheem Morris, just on that same point, being a defensive coach, I think he would find value in AJ Terrell and trying to iron out these negotiations. I think that serves in the Falcons' favor and in AJ Terrell's favor too. Have a defensive head coach that understands how valuable that position is for a guy that's really in his prime at this day and age. I really like AJ Terrell and his durability, really mostly only missing at most 3 games in any of the seasons that he has played. And if I were to give an estimation of how much he could get, I think I would probably say 18 to 17 million for AJ Terrell from me if I was doing these contract negotiations. I think that's enough where it's close to those other guys, and of course you could do some salary cap gymnastics and work out signing bonuses, base salaries, and just roster bonuses at different points in time that could elevate this a little bit more. But just on the basis of that deal, I think around 18 million or 17 million, if it works out better for the Falcons, would be something that I think both parties could be happy with. I don't see AJ Terrell really valuing himself at 20 up until this point, but who knows? I could be wrong. He could see himself as that guy, but if I were the Falcons, I would be offering around that range and not think it's too expensive for AJ Terrell. I think he's done enough for them, and in comparison to those other guys that got paid in terms of the market, I think it works out for them to pay him around that much. I don't really see him leaving. I don't see how they could just let him walk out the door. But I'm anticipating this getting done probably, if not before training camp, early on in the stage of training camp, because I haven't heard that he has been holding out, so I don't think he will, but you don't want this to carry over any longer. So AJ Terrell, I'm saying he's staying, but if you guys think otherwise, let me know in the chat box or in the comment section of this video. With that being the case now, we have 2 more segments to talk about on today's show. One of them, still on the defensive side of the ball, Malik Hooker talks about the discipline that they're anticipating this year on the defensive side of the ball with Mike Zimmer and the differences between Mike Zimmer and Dan Quinn, who is now the head coach of the Commanders. And also, on the topic of differences, Josh Jacobs talks about the biggest differences he has already noticed between the Las Vegas Raiders and him joining the Green Bay Packers. Those are coming up very soon. We'll be right back after this break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Back here now on the show, talking some more about the defensive side of the ball, more on Malik Hooker, and comments about the defense in Dallas, because basically he made some comments on Keyshawn Johnson's podcast, All Facts, No Breaks. Previously, when we talked about it, it was a comment that he made on Micah Parsons and him and his, actions off of the field during the offseason about focusing on the podcast, potentially over his responsibilities on the defense. So now he went a little bit further on just the defense as a whole. To give some context about it, their former defensive coordinator, Dan Quinn, he took the head coaching job with the Washington Commanders this year. So Dallas went over and hired Mike Zimmer as the new defensive coordinator. He was previously with the team. He had a stint with them, moved on, most notably with the Minnesota Vikings, but now he's back in Dallas. And Malik Hooker was on Keyshawn Johnson's podcast and talked about the differences he's already noticed and is anticipating in 2024. There was something interesting that I thought it would be to bring up on in this segment was what Malik Hooker had to say of those differences. Basically, he said, there is a certain way you have to coach certain guys. I feel like because of how player-oriented Dan Quinn was, guys would relate to him and he wouldn't have to coach a certain way that Zim does now. And he explained it a little bit more, basically breaking down what each of them bring. And I thought it was fascinating, just looking at the differences. Mike Zimmer, he started off with him. He said the way that he coaches already on the defensive side of the ball through OTAs and mandatory minicamp, he basically said that Mike Zimmer gives his players a few chances, to get something right. If you mess up 1, 2 times, 3 times, it's all right. He'll let you have that range a little bit, a average to long leash per se in this instance. But the difference with him is if you keep messing it up and he sees that maybe you're just not getting it, you're just not fitting with his system, he'll take you out, he'll bring somebody else in to try them out and try to fit this mold of his system. Basically, his system is gospel. His system is his system. He's not going away. He's not skewing away from his defensive scheme, his philosophy. It's that way. I don't like saying it's that way or the highway. I just don't like that saying, but it seems like it is that way with Mike Zimmer. He is very dead set on following what he believes will work, and he mentioned it before. I saw an interview that he did, or just a session that he did with the media, that he mentioned that these players are going to have to adapt to his system now. Now that Dan Quinn's gone, yeah, they had success with that, but they're going to have to adjust to his system. So he's very much set on his beliefs, his schemes, and things like that. And he went on to talk about Dan Quinn, and he kept mentioning how player-oriented Dan Quinn was. That was the phrase he used over and over again with Dan Quinn, that being Malik Hooker. He said that, and he related it a little bit to Mike Zimmer by saying if something wasn't right or if somebody kept messing up. In a similar situation with Mike Zimmer, Dan Quinn, instead of changing that player out, he'd make it easier and almost simplify it for everyone, or especially that player, to be able to get them to find success in whatever they're doing, whatever they're trying to execute on that defensive side of the ball. Eric says, kind of reminds me of Sean Payton. They usually come from that era, honestly. Mike Zimmer, Sean Payton, Bill Belichick, in a way, also being very set on doing things his way. Those guys, sort of the old guard of these coaches, were very set on their experience, what they learned to be successful, and they weren't going to move on from that. So that's a good point. That's a good comparison with Sean Payton. That was one of the things that was brought up and how everything sort of played out, with Russell Wilson and some of the guys with the Broncos and how they've mentioned it. Sean Payton is very oriented on doing things his way. It's no different with Mike Zimmer, whereas Dan Quinn was a little bit more understanding, a little bit hand on the shoulder, being more, what's the word I'm looking for? Being a little bit more of a teacher, not so much of a sergeant and doing things his way. He was more understanding and changed the way he went about things or how he explained it to these players rather than just changing the player out and trying to find the perfect player to fit his system. And also Malik Hooker mentioned on that point that the biggest difference he'll anticipate this year is the discipline that they're going to have on that side of the ball. And it makes sense, right? If Mike Zimmer is hammering these points down on how you have to do it this way, you have to fit it this way, it has to look the way I'm explaining it to you. If they do it right, they're going to be super disciplined because they're going to know it like the back of their hand, and they're going to be very much tuned in on what is expected of them whenever they set up or in any kind of formation or coverage that they set up in. They're going to know what to expect if they do execute it the right way. So that fell right in line with what Malik Hooker was saying on how different Dan Quinn and Mike Zimmer are. But now I get into this area, these questions of, how successful will this system be for the Dallas Cowboys, with not only the fact that it is different from what Dan Quinn brought, but the circumstances around the Cowboys just in general still make me question on how this defense could look, and how different they'll look in just terms of production, and how we could see a dip a little bit in numbers, in stats compared to the last few seasons with Dan Quinn, because once Dan Quinn took over a Dallas defense that was historically bad when he got hired, since that point they got better in yards allowed and points allowed each and every year that Dan Quinn was the defensive coordinator. In yards allowed, they went from 4th in this first season, then they were 9th in the NFL, then 6th in the NFL just last year in yards allowed in the NFL as a defense. And from the points allowed perspective of this, in his first season as defensive coordinator with Dan Quinn, they ranked 19th, and then they moved up to 12th, and then this last year they were ranked at 5th in the NFL in points allowed just in the NFL. So you could see how consistently they got better, really buying into Dan Quinn's system and getting progressively better over a period of time that they knew they had. So they bought into it more and more, and they got better in that time. But where this situation sort of deviates and how it could affect the defense and their performance, in my opinion, is that Mike Zimmer, like a bunch of the other coaches on the Dallas Cowboys, are only on a one-year deal. So will that job security, will the just confusion, the uncertainty around Mike Zimmer continuing beyond this season affect the learning process, the buy-in process from his players on defense? Especially with the way Mike Zimmer coaches, I could see a world where some players can get annoyed by the way he coaches, can just be a little frustrated if they're not getting it, and Mike Zimmer's just taking them out. And then from that point on, you can see where it can get to a point where they're upset by it, they're not getting it, they're frustrated with him and his system, and then they start getting into this new field of thinking where they start to acknowledge the fact that he's only on a one-year deal, so why do they have to learn this? And you don't want it to get to that point. That's probably the worst-case scenario when they've given up, and Mike Zimmer has lost the locker room, to just say it in a general phrase. But that is something I do have questions about. If People know that he's on a 1-year deal, and if things aren't going well, at what point do these players just, stop trying to buy in and Mike Zimmer actually loses this locker room? And also, it also doesn't help, that they lost pieces on that side of the ball like Dorrance Armstrong, Neville Gallimore, Dante Fowler, Stephon Gilmore, Jaron Kearse on that defensive side of the ball. Leaders, more experienced players from that defense over the last few years, they're now gone. So on top of learning a new system, you have to integrate new starting pieces to this defense to try and get everything to fit in a system where there's already, or in a season where there's already a lot of pressure going in to this team with the contract negotiations, with getting over that playoff hump. All those things that play into it. Now you have a lot of new pieces trying to fit it in. It's a lot of things on a checklist of duties that the Cowboys have to fulfill to at least get back to the point where they were last year. So all that bundled into this thing, into this situation this year, I don't think it helps their case for being any better, especially on the defensive side of the ball where that was arguably their more reliable side of the football. That was their almost backbone of this team with how successful and reliable it had been. So now with all these new changes coming in, I'm starting to question that side of the ball just as much as I'm questioning the offense with the contracts and new players coming in and all these things like that. So it's not all positive though, just as a last, it's not all negative though, I should have said, as they do get Trayvon Diggs back to pair him up with Deron Bland, so that's a good thing. But is it going to be enough? I have my doubts about it. Malik Hooker thinks they're going to be a lot more disciplined, at least just based on what he's seen from Mike Zimmer. So hopefully that's the case. Hopefully that could get them over the hump. But even still, they have a lot of questions to answer in 2024. So that is the case with the Cowboys based on what Malik Hooker says. But we have one more topic to get to on today's show. Josh Jacobs just briefly talking about the differences that he's noticed with the Las Vegas Raiders and why he decided to come over to the Green Bay Packers and help them on their quest to becoming one of the best teams in the NFC. There's a lot riding on them, and Jacobs should help, so we're going to get into discussing that a little bit more when we return in just a few seconds. Thank you for joining me back here on this last segment on today's show. Briefly going over Josh Jacobs and just his situation with the Green Bay Packers. Going over the biggest differences on why he decided to come over to Green Bay compared with what he was dealing with the Las Vegas Raiders. One of the biggest and weirdest transactions this year in free agency to me was the signing of Josh Jacobs to Green Bay and then Aaron Jones right after that being released. Obviously, it was going to happen, but it all happened so fast. He was released, then he signed for the Minnesota Vikings, and on top of that, the Green Bay Packers gave Josh Jacobs a 4-year, $48 million deal, and basically Green Bay couldn't come to a contract restructuring with Aaron Jones, or else I don't think they would have gone through with this deal because now they're paying him, at least in general, just looking at 4 years, $48 million, they're paying him about $12 million per year, and that's pretty lofty for a running back this day and age. But they were benefited with this deal because it was a lot friendlier with Josh Jacobs than I think they viewed it with Aaron Jones. Even if on paper you just look at it as $12 million, only $14.8 million is guaranteed in that first year with Josh Jacobs through signing bonuses, the base salary of $1.2 million, and also games and workout bonuses all thrown in there as well. That adds up to the $14.8 million that's guaranteed in his first year. But then after that, it's really up to Green Bay and how they decide to move on with that contract, because they have team options on the remaining years of Josh Jacobs' contract. So after the first year, the remaining 3 years, the Packers have team options on him where they have the option to move on from him or just change something about his contract with that of Josh Jacobs. So that's how Josh Jacobs ended up with Green Bay. But from his standpoint, from his point of view, what was he seeing? What was his sort of feelings around not wanting to stay in Las Vegas, where I thought they were sort of building something that I could have gotten behind, especially if Jacobs stayed. I thought that could have been a great situation because I am a fan of Antonio Pierce. You still have Devontae Adams. Obviously, at the time, you don't know that you're drafting Brock Bowers, but now adding Brock and still having Josh, I thought it could have been something special. And it's still going to be encouraging, but Josh Jacobs really didn't see it that way. And from his point of view, from what he was seeing, he basically broke it down in a way where he said there, like you see on your screen, he said, I would say one of the main reasons was just the certainty of what I'm going to get. There's already a lot of structure. There's already a lot of stuff in place. Having another new head coach over there meaning Las Vegas, my fourth coach while I was there, I never felt there was any stability with the Las Vegas Raiders. And pretty clear-cut, pretty straightforward answer from Jacobs. Pretty straightforward, and I didn't think he was going to say it like that, but you could also understand, and it's hard to argue with that point because because of the fact that he is a running back. We've talked at length about the running back market and how just devalued it is at this point in time, and with that being the case, already having 4 new head coaches in your time in the NFL, and you have that situation. You have that situation looking at you, the 4th head coach on one team in your time in the NFL, and then your other option is a very much exciting, young, very anticipated Green Bay Packers team that's offering you this much up front, at least in your first year. It's really not that hard of a decision to go with the uncertainty or go with a team that a lot of people are projecting to be very good this year. And Josh Jacobs is a very talented running back, so he's only going to add to that with that running back room that they have, A.J. Dillon and the rookie, I'm forgetting his name, but they have plans for all of them, to use all of them. And then obviously that wide receiver room, and not to mention obviously Jordan Love. You get the picture of why obviously Green Bay looks like the better situation, and it's hard to argue with Josh Jacobs on that standpoint. But Josh Jacobs also believed that he could be the missing piece after he said he was watching how close Green Bay was last year to beating the San Francisco 49ers. And again, that's another encouraging point to want to be part of this young, exciting team where they took a lot of people's best team in the NFC right down to the wire, and they had a great chance of beating them, and he believes he could be that piece to get him over that hump next year in 2024. But also talking some more about the coaching standpoint, right? Because that is a point that Josh Jacobs brought up. It all sort of stems from that, you could say, with Antonio Pierce and Matt LaFleur. You look at Pierce, he's entering his first year as a head coach, while Matt LaFleur has been the coach of the Green Bay Packers since 2019, and they've only gotten better over time, especially now that they miraculously found their franchise quarterback in Jordan Love. It didn't look good at the start, throughout his whole time just sitting on the bench, wondering when he would play, and then when he finally does get in there, you don't have a great start to the season, but just like in an instant, it turns around, complete 180, you're performing well in the playoffs, you look like you've been there every year, and just now they have their franchise quarterback, and now they're absolutely rolling at this point in time. So that's, again, the similarities and differences between the two head coaches and why it wasn't too hard of a decision, at least, how Josh Jacobs is putting it, to make this choice to move to the Green Bay Packers. And Eric says, is this Josh Jacobs' best coach throughout his career? I'm trying to think of the coaches that he has had. It can't be. It has to be his best coach, just because in every year that he's had, the coach has been fired. You know what I'm saying? So he's had a new head coach in every year. This is going to be his fourth one. So Matt LaFleur has just been very stable. The Green Bay Packers organization has bought in to his beliefs, even if at some points it didn't look great with some playoff losses while Aaron Rodgers was there. They've kept true to Matt LaFleur, believed in him, believed in what he could get out of Jordan Love, and now you're reaping the benefits of that. So I would say yes, this is definitely the best coach that Josh Jacobs has had, and probably the best situation because he has dealt with injuries. And even though he had a really good year, he was the rushing leader a few years back with the Raiders, I think this situation with the Packers suits him a little bit better because he is part of a running back committee. He is looked at as the lead back. Obviously, I think he should be, but you have an A.J. Dillon, you have another rookie running back that they drafted. You don't have to take so much wear and tear on your body and be so dependent on Josh Jacobs to perform, whereas that was his role with the Las Vegas Raiders. He had to have a good game to give him a good chance to win. Now you have a plethora of weapons surrounding Josh Jacobs, and he can only add to it rather than being the main deciding factor on if they win games, if they're close in a game. I think that pressure alleviated off of him will do him wonders and also just benefit the Green Bay Packers overall, especially when you get into the instability of this and the instability with the Raiders. It's really a no-brainer why Josh Jacobs decided to stay, but you know, I mentioned it was just a weird transaction, how it all happened so fast. I really thought he was going to stay just because I felt the Raiders, I don't know how much they offered him, but maybe the Packers just offered more as well. So that was just another point in favor of the Packers. But overall, Josh Jacobs really just saying the main difference there. And now we head into 2024, and you really have a tough time picking out the weaknesses in this Packers team just in general. Their defense is very underrated. I was pleasantly surprised with them towards the end of last year and how they got stops, they got turnovers, and just being a real nuisance to some of these offenses that were high-powered, like the 49ers and the Cowboys one as well. The defense surprised me from that point, and they only added to it, really. They didn't lose too many pieces, if any. And the offensive side of the ball, the only thing that could be a worry is that offensive line that I talked about a few episodes back. You lost John Runyon. There's a lot of new guys and some guys that maybe haven't really convinced you up until this point. It did the job last year, but the depth that they have at that offensive line and how that contributes obviously to the run game could be something to watch. But overall, if they stay healthy, it's going to be hard to see the Packers really having any glaring weaknesses in 2024. There are a lot of people's favorites to really be a major contender to the 49ers, the Lions, the Eagles. It should be exciting. We're going to get to see this high-powered team in Week 1 in Brazil against the Eagles, so very much looking forward to that. Very much looking forward to seeing Josh Jacobs and how he performs with his new team. But with that being the case, that'll wrap it up for today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. I want to thank you guys for joining me on today's show, and also remind you guys to please like, follow, and subscribe to the show, and following the network on all forms of social media as well. If you want to see more of the show in your own free time, check out the GSMC Podcast Network channel and the GSMC Sports Network channel for a variety of different ways of NFL content being put out there in YouTube Shorts, individual segment videos, and entirety of the long live shows that are all on there as well. A final reminder, tune in every weekday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time for more live shows discussing the NFL and storylines around this great league with me, Manny Maradiaga, as your host. Thanking you guys for joining me. I hope to see you guys all back here with me again tomorrow.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn ain't